Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. The American farmer, tiller of our amber waves of grain, caretaker of our fruited plain, has always been the emblem of our nation. Founding father Thomas Jefferson was an agrarian romantic who elevated the farmer to mythic status. But the Jefferson example is instructive because while our agrarian history is washed in sepia tones of nostalgia, we have all too often forgotten the oppressive conditions of so much farm labor. Whether the slaves of Jefferson's Monticello or the immigrants doing back-breaking work today, America's real relationship with those who work our land is more complicated than this year's Dodge Ram Super Bowl commercial would have us believe. Take this fact. Between 1940 and 1974, the number of African-American farmers fell from just more than 681,000 to fewer than 46,000. That's a drop of 93%. And this decline was no accident. It was the result in part of common practices at the USDA. In 1997, after decades of complaints that the Department of Agriculture had routinely denied or limited loans to African-American farmers while freely distributing them to white farmers, 400 black farmers filed suit against the USDA in the case of Pigford versus Glickman. And the suit argued that the USDA had routinely discriminated against black farmers in the allocation of farm loans, debt restructuring, and crop payments. In 1999, a judge agreed, leading to more than $1 billion in compensation. In the process of paying out that compensation, the government denied approximately 30% of farmers' claims. So concerns about the process led to a second settlement known as Pigford in 2010. The USDA and Department of Justice agreed to an additional $1.25 billion settlement, which began paying out claims last year. Many agreed justice had finally come to generations of black farmers. But last week, this headline hit the front page of the New York Times. U.S. opens spigot after farmers claim discrimination. The article detailed the allocation of claims in Pigford 2, characterized as, quote, a runaway train driven by racial politics, pressure from influential members of Congress, and law firms that stand to gain more than $130 million in fees. With this high-profile report, the Pigford case has once again been reopened, and the legacy of black farming is in the balance. At the table is Ira Katz-Nielsen, professor of history and political science at Columbia University, MSNBC host Karen Finney, Richard Kim, executive editor at TheNation.com, and Democratic State Senator Hank Sanders from Alabama, who is the lead counsel for the black farmers in the Pigford cases. Joining us also from Birmingham, Alabama, is Democratic Congresswoman Terry Sewell. Congresswoman Sewell, so nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
So you represent a district that is very rural. How has Pigford been received among your constituents?
Well, look, you know, my constituents, a large part of them, were part of the black farmers that were part of the Pigford 1 case. And the Pigford 2 settlement, so many are waiting right now for their checks. I mean, the fact of the matter is that my grandfather died at 92 without receiving his $50,000. And there were so many egregious complaints against the USDA that I really thought that the New York Times article was a gross mischaracterization of the process.
So, Congresswoman Sewell, I think that's been my absolute concern. I have been waiting for a front-page story about Pigford because this is such an important part of our history and contemporary practices, but then the front-page story that we get ends up saying, I have to say it, like some kind of agricultural welfare queen anxiety.
Exactly, and you know, that is such a gross mischaracterization. You know, years and years, decades of being unfairly treated by the USDA and not being able to get loans. I mean, my grandfather talked about it incessantly. He farmed in Lowndes County, Alabama, and as I go across my district, so many were adversely affected that those farms, that land just is lying idle, you know, right now. And I think that that goes to your point that we saw a 93% decrease in farming across the board. And, you know, I can tell you that to actually get a claim through was a more difficult process than the New York Times indicated. The reality is that people had to certify that they actually had been discriminated against under penalty of perjury. And I know that there were so many. I think that you have on your panel State Senator Hank Sanders, who was a lead counsel on this. And, you know, I can tell you that people are waiting right now now to receive retribution and restitution for decades of discrimination.
So, Hank, let me come to you on exactly that, Senator, because the language of turning on the spigot, just sending out federal money, is that an appropriate characterization of what's happened in Pigford, too?
It's not only not appropriate, it's a terrible disservice to the entire process. I think it's really important that we understand the scope and the nature of the discrimination. What happened is that when this bill was conceived back in the 30s, Henry Wallace really wanted the federal government to be in control of it. He couldn't get it through Congress unless he put the local white people in control of it. And when he put them in control of it, their goal was to only have available to work on their farm. So they simply made sure that there were no blacks to participate whatsoever in getting loans. If you're farming, you have to have money in the spring for equipment, you have to have money for seeds and fertilizer and other kinds of things. And if you don't get it, then you're not able to farm. As a result, what they did was just drove hundreds of thousands of black farmers out of business, and many who tried to get in, they prevented them from getting in.
And Ira, this is precisely the story that you tell. So I've just been reading your litigation, and then I'm reading this book, and this is exactly the story that you tell.
Well, in the 1930s, roughly half the Democratic Party in Congress came from the 17 states that still mandated racial segregation. These Jim Crow representatives had as their first priority protecting the racial order of the South. And in bill after bill after bill, including Social Security Act, including the Fair Labor Standards Act that gave us a minimum wage, including the Wagner Act for unions, and including agricultural legislation. Farm workers and maids were either kept out of the benefits, that's what African Americans did in the South when they worked for a wage, or local administration was the answer to the worries of the South about how federal law would play out. And in consequence, Jim Crow rules under the aegis of the federal government governed the legislation and implementation of the New Deal.
Right, and so the effects are real. We can look at the decline of black farmers. 1920, 1 in 7 farmers is African American. 1982, on the back end of that, 1 in every 67 farmers is African American. Black farmland declined. In 1910, 15 million acres of black-owned farmland. 1982, 3.1 million acres. I mean, this isn't sort of on the margins. Right. This is the decimation of a life, of a way of being, and therefore of an ability to pass on. Land is what we pass on intergenerationally. That's right. So why the New York Times article now? I got to tell you, it just felt to me like a hit piece in certain. I mean, on the one hand, it felt like this really complicated, deeply researched. But then I kept thinking, but wait a minute, what are the motivations here?
The thing that bothered me about the piece, I mean, you can believe that perhaps there may have been parts of the law that were written poorly or administered poorly, because heaven knows government doesn't always do a good job.
Sure.
At the same time, the two underlying themes that were the most disturbing, number one, this idea of just inefficiency. We were talking about that before. Corruption, that under Obama, right, that it's inefficient. Government isn't working. And that's a theme we've heard time and time. This black president is, inefficient government. Secondly, this theme that we're starting to hear time and time again is who's deserving and who's not deserving. This vilification of poor people as lazy and undeserving. And study after study, when we talk about welfare, and like you said, the welfare queens, I mean, there are very specific things that come into people's minds when you talk about that. That's what bothered me so much about this story, is that it seemed to be just playing into those very same themes. And then you read, crazy Steve King, congressman from Iowa, saying, this is just a buyout for black people. They're just trying to buy off minorities. That's what's so disturbing right now.
Yeah. There's also in a more immediate historical context I think the piece missed, which is that in 1983, Reagan uses a series of brutal budget cuts in a very targeted way, and one of the offices he basically shuts down is the Civil Rights Division inside the USDA, right? So that produces a situation where claims of discrimination are being sent and literally thrown into the trash can, which creates an evidence gap, right? You're actually not collecting people who are actually trying to put in writing, right, their claims of discrimination. So by the time the settlement comes about, you are looking at a series of cases where the evidence is not clear. It's not going to be always documented. That's why they allowed oral testimony to be a part of the settlement. Now, did that create some loose standards that aren't transparent and accountable? It looks like from the Times report that might have been the case. But we need to find out the scale of that, and then we need to think about this. If we think about this as reparations in some way, right? The point of reparations is actually to be sort of historically minded and to understand the many times in which discrimination impacted this group of people. And that's, I think, the kind of best way to frame this as a historical inquiry about justice.
And Congresswoman Sewell, so on the one hand, we've got this historic frame, but Representative Sewell, it also feels to me like there's a very clear claim being made at this present Congress. So given that you represent this district, are there actions that you are planning to take or others in Congress are planning to take around what's now been raised?
You know, the Congressional Black Caucus has traditionally been the caucus in Congress that has been the voice for the discriminated and for the voice of the black farmers. And so I know that we are all quite concerned about this article. And a lot of us prior to the article was really concerned about the appropriated money that has already been set aside for the current Pigford 2 settlement, those checks actually coming to the discriminated black farmers. So I think that we in Congress have already appropriated this money. I think it's incumbent upon us, obviously, to get waste, fraud, and abuse out of the system. But I really do feel like it was a patent mischaracterization for us to, for this article and this journalist to suggest that all the claims or the majority of the claims were fraudulent. You know, I can tell you that as I go across my district, that I hear time and time again stories of how black farmers were discriminated against, how they had to sell their land. You know, at the end of the day, we're talking about farmers here. What's more American than our farmers? The folks who, you know, really, you know, grew the corn and the food that we all eat. And I just think that it's really, really sad this day and age that we would try to make this a racial issue.
Thank you to Congresswoman Sewell in Alabama. I'm going to come right back to you, Hank, as soon as we come back, because there's much more on this question of Pigford. But I thank the Congresswoman for joining us. More when we come back.